All right, here we are preparing for the second coming, the study of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. This is lesson number 1. This is the introduction part of this series. I want to begin 1st Thessalonians and 2nd Thessalonians. I want to begin talking about this particular series by reading something out of Matthew. Okay, so Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 to 44, Jesus says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think He will." I don't know about you, but when I was a child, my parents taught me to be ready for the next day. And I mean, not just as a theory. It was a very concrete thing that they did. School clothes had to be ready. You're not waiting until tomorrow morning to figure out what socks you're going to wear. Make sure your stuff is ready for school. Homework is done. And here's a quaint idea that may be not circulating much these days. You weren't allowed to go out after supper. Yeah, you could, after school, you go see your friends, go play ball at the park or whatever, but once after supper, that was the end of that. You weren't going anywhere after supper during the week. Why? Because you had to get ready for school the next day, whatever you had to do, homework and so on and so forth. As a teenager, as a young guy, I would moan and whine, and everybody else is out there except me. I'm the only one at home, which wasn't true, but anyways, I would moan and whine about that. But I am grateful to them because their early lessons helped mold my work ethic and the discipline that I practice in my ministry, and has helped me succeed in my career. When I became a Christian later on in life, I learned that this principle of preparedness was also true in Christian living as well. Same kind of attitude. As Christians, we must also prepare, but not just for tomorrow. That's why I read this passage here. We need to prepare for that day when Jesus will return, because when that day comes, there is not going to be a tomorrow. It'll be the end. Boom. No time to apologize, no time to prepare. If you weren't prepared when He comes, it'll be too late. So I say all of this as a bit of an introduction for Paul's epistles to the Thessalonians, which we'll be studying. These were written with the purpose of encouraging these Christians to be ready for the last day when Jesus would return. Now, it's a day that could have happened in their lifetimes, but didn't. They had to be ready because it could have happened then, but it didn't happen. So that means that the last day could happen during our lifetime. We don't think about that. We always see that as someone else's thing in the future, but it could happen in our lifetime. So we're going to study these letters in order to prepare ourselves should the day happen in our lifetime, because it could. And why do I say that? Because Jesus says, you don't know when. He says, be ready. So, since this is going to be a formal study of this first epistle, I'd like to begin with giving you some introductory information about the place and the circumstances in which this congregation, the Thessalonian congregation, was established. Good way to start a Bible study, put everything in context, make sure everybody, we're all on the same page when we finally get into the text. So look at this map here. Thessalonica, the city. Today, this is today's map. Thessalonica is a modern day city in Salonika in southeastern Europe. It's between Romania and Bulgaria to the north, Yugoslavia, Albania to the west. It is now, as it was in the first century, a port city in central Macedonia, Greece, on the edge of the Aegean Sea. And today it has about 500,000 people in population. In Paul's day, it was originally built in 315 BC by the Macedonian king Cassander, and it was named after his wife, who was Alexander the Great's half-sister. So, a way to honor the boss, if you wish. In its location, Thessalonica was a natural seaport, and as a main highway route from Rome to the east, it became the largest trading center for the region of Macedonia in its day, with a population of about 200,000 at that time. And that was pretty big for a city, in that era, to have 200,000 people. It was within sight of Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus was a real mountain range that was believed to be the home of the gods in Greek mythology. And because of its location, Thessalonica became a wealthy, cosmopolitan city where many cultures converged. So you had Roman and Greek and Jewish, and all cultures came together in that city. Now, because it was a center for trade, there was also a colony of Jews who lived there and who had built a synagogue in order to practice their ancient religion in the midst of this worldly and pagan and wicked city. So it was into this city in the year 51 AD that Paul the Apostle found his way after receiving a vision or a calling from the Lord. So let's talk about this church a little bit. The church in Thessalonica was established there in approximately 51 AD, as I mentioned, while Paul was on his second missionary journey. The book of Acts recounts the events surrounding the founding of this congregation. And it's important that we know this because it will inform what Paul is saying later on. We're going to understand why he's saying what he's saying if we understand how this church was originally established. So the book of Acts recounts the events surrounding the founding of this congregation. So first, there's a vision that takes place. Paul and Silas and Timothy, they're traveling. They're on their second missionary journey, and they're in the process of strengthening the churches that they've already established on the first missionary journey, when all of a sudden they have a vision or a calling. And that was Paul's method. He went, established congregations, strengthened them, and then he'd go back home to the home base, if you wish, to report, and then he'd leave a second time and he'd go back to the churches that he had established to strengthen them, answer their questions, build them up, and so on and so forth. So he was on this type of missionary journey when he had a vision. So let's kind of read the passage here in Acts chapter 16. It says, "They passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And after they came to Mysia, they were trying to go to Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. And passing by Mysia, they came down to Troas. A vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him, saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' When he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go ahead into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them." So you see the way things are working out. Paul said, "You know what? We've strengthened the churches. Let's break some new ground here. Let's go to Asia." And it says the Spirit prevented him. How? Who knows? Maybe the bridge was washed out. Maybe they ran out of money. More mission works are guided many times because you've run out of money. And you're saying, "Lord, if you want me to do this, give me some money." And no money comes, so you have to, who knows? But in some way, the Spirit is preventing him from breaking new ground in that area. So what do? They cross the Aegean Sea and they make their way to Philippi, where through a series of events they establish a church there. So let's read about that. It says, "So pulling out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the day following to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony. And we were staying in this city some days." It says, and on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to a riverside where we were supposing that there would be a place of prayer. And we sat down and began speaking to the women who had assembled. A woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshiper of God, was listening. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house. And she prevailed upon us. So later on, we're going to read that their presence and their activities in this place here, where they've established a small congregation, beginning with these women, their presence and activities stir up a riot, and they're jailed, but they're miraculously released. And after gaining their freedom, they make their way about 100 miles south, and they come to the city of Thessalonica. Now Luke recounts the church being planted there along with further troubles encountered by these missionaries. So let's read that passage. It says, now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I'm proclaiming to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar, and attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the world have come here also. And Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there's another king, Jesus. They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received the pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. The brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. So we see that Paul spent about a month there, 1 month. It's not a long time, not even a quarter. Here we have, our quarters are 3 months, for Bible study. 1 month. He stays there teaching them, and so on and so forth, before he's chased away to the neighboring city of Berea, some 50 miles west of Thessalonica. So this was not a lot of teaching time for a new church. You see what I'm saying? I mean, nowadays, one of the things that happens a lot when someone becomes a Christian, there's a lot of moral teaching that takes place. Christians don't do this, Christians try to avoid that kind of worldly living, and so on and so forth. But here he's beginning with Jews, and we're thinking that the Jews had already a lot of training in virtuous living, let's put it that way. So there perhaps was less focus on that type of teaching to bring them to a level of normal Christian lifestyle. It was more, who is Jesus? How is He the Messiah? How is He the promised one? Okay, this would be the focus probably of the teaching, demonstrating that Jesus is the true Messiah from the what we would call the Old Testament. The Jews at that time simply called from their own scriptures. But even so, 3 weeks is not a month, is not a very long time. So Paul spends some time in Berea teaching before moving on to Athens in southern Greece, and he leaves Silas and Timothy in this city, Berea. And he goes to Athens. He makes a few converts there, and he makes the famous sermon on Mars Hill to the Athenian philosophers, recorded in Acts chapter 17. And soon after, he leaves Athens, and he heads for his final destination in Greece, which is the city of Corinth. And we know Corinth, right, because we have those epistles, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. Well, that was Corinth. Now, here's the point here, the historical context. It is during his 18 months in Corinth that Paul wrote the 2 letters that he sent to the Thessalonian church. All right. So let's move ahead now and see what is the situation that brings about his writing these 2 letters. once Timothy, remember Timothy was left behind, once Timothy makes his way to Corinth to be with Paul, he begins to report on the progress of the young churches that they had established in the region. Okay? When it came to the Thessalonica, to the church in Thessalonica, Timothy brings news that these young Christians were bearing well under the persecution that they were suffering because of their faith. He did mention, however, that several of their number had died, and they were confused as to what would happen to those who died before the Lord returned. So obviously, Paul had done some teaching concerning the return of the Lord. Not only that he was the true Messiah according to Jewish prophecy and Scripture, but also, his life, his death, his resurrection from the dead. Certainly he taught that. That's the gospel. And apparently some material concerning his return. Not a whole lot maybe, but that this was part of God's plan, that Jesus would return to judge, and so on and so forth. So all of a sudden, Paul had taught them that Jesus was to return, but they hadn't considered the idea that some of them might die before that event took place. They assumed, never assumed, but they assumed, okay, Jesus is coming back. Okay, month or two, 6 months. His ministry only lasted 3 years, so surely it's not going to take 3 years. And then all of a sudden grandpa dies, and so dies of a disease, a baby dies at birth. They're starting to ask themselves questions. So Paul, not very long after he had established this church, writes to them in order to calm their fears and to provide further instruction concerning the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, this Thessalonian letter is the earliest full discussion related to the second coming of Christ and the resurrection of the saints. It was the earliest letter written. It was a letter written before Revelation. I tell people sometimes, they say, I want to find out about the second coming of Jesus. Well, where in Revelation do I find that? I said, no, you don't go to Revelation to find that. You go to Thessalonians to find that, because that was the question. And Paul answers that question very clearly. Almost, A, B, this happens, that happens, this happens, that happens. Very simple instruction is found in his letters. So scholars have no doubts concerning the authorship of this letter, since Paul names himself in it, and historians note that it was widely distributed and accepted by the early church. And this was two key factors in determining the authenticity and inspiration of New Testament documents. When people began to collect the Scriptures together, they tried to bring them together, the writings of the apostles and so on and so forth, they had to figure out, well, which one, there was lots of material out there. A lot more than the 27 books of the New Testament. There were a lot of people writing about Jesus, all kinds of, quote, gospels floating around. And so they wanted to know which are the genuine ones, which are the ones we will put into what's called the canon. The word canon, means measuring. Which ones measure up to be from God, inspired from the apostles. And the criteria to decide which ones measured up, among others, was, first of all, was it written by an apostle, a legitimate apostle? And number two, had that document circulated among the early church? Was it well known among the early church? And the reason for that is, if it was well known among the early church, who better to denounce fake documents than the early church? Because you had the apostles who were still alive. And so the apostles who were still alive could say, no, this is not good, this is not inspired, so on and so forth. And so we're in pretty good shape for the authenticity of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It's also a model epistle when examining the various growing pains experienced by a new church. Like in the mission field, you only have a couple of weeks to teach. Which epistle am I going to teach? Am I going to do Romans? Am I going to do if you've only got a couple of weeks, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians be a pretty good epistle to teach, especially to a new church. So the Thessalonian congregation had been established and taught in the space of a few weeks. They were now facing persecution as well as confusion about the doctrine. And so Paul writes to them in order to calm their fears and also to teach them what they wanted to understand but couldn't without direct information from God. How do you figure out what's going to happen at the end? Who's going to answer that question for you? Well, no human being anyways. So they look to the inspired apostle for that. All right, so the letter deals with 3 main themes which make up the body of the letter, and these are bookended, if you wish, by a salutation at the beginning and an exhortation, if you wish, and a final greeting at the end. So there are a lot of ways, to break up an epistle, depending on how you're going to study it. But this one here has a pretty straightforward breakdown. First of all, Paul's prayer of thanksgiving, chapter 1, verses 1 to 10. Then Paul defends his conduct among them. You're going to find out that he was only there 3 weeks, but he was already being attacked. His credibility was being attacked. And so he gives a defense of his activity among them, chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3. A very long part of the epistle is devoted to that. Because what good is his teaching if the people, hearing him don't believe that he's a credible teacher? If in their mind they're saying, oh, he's a fake, or he's really not credible, he really isn't an apostle, you're just wasting your time. In the church, the best way to split up a church, any church, a church of 10,000 or a church of 10, the best way to break that church up is what? Attack the leaders. Undermine the credibility of the leaders. If you do that, if you split them up, it's a piece of cake after that. So that's what was happening there. Number 3, Paul exhorts the Thessalonians to pure conduct. Some of them, were pagans before. Some of them Greeks. And so an exhortation to pure conduct. Then Paul reveals Jesus' teaching concerning the end times, if you wish. What's going to happen? And then Paul instructs the church in preparing for the end. So that's how we're going to kind of study this first epistle. So as we go through the first letter, we're going to see some things that Paul is trying to accomplish with this brief epistle. First of all, he's going to try to express his feelings. Oh, really? We hear all the time, don't trust your feelings. When it comes to religion, don't trust your feelings. Well, when it comes to doctrine, don't trust your feelings. But how do you find out the genuineness of a person if that person doesn't express their feelings to you? So in the opening section, we'll see Paul expressing his joy and gratitude for their faithfulness and their loyalty to him and to his helpers. They were a young church and Paul hadn't been with them for very long, but they were faithful in a lot of ways despite the attacks leveled against them and the attacks leveled against Paul. A great reward for ministers is seeing the faithfulness and growth of the members. People don't go into ministry for money. You don't get rich becoming a preacher. So where's the reward? Well, the reward is seeing the church grow. There's the reward. I'll tell you, nothing kills the zeal of the preacher or the missionary more than unfaithful Christians. It's why a lot of them leave to go to other places. Why are you leaving? You've been with us 6 years, 7 years, And a lot of times, unfortunately, the preachers are delicate or trying to be politically correct. Well, it's time to move on, blah, blah, blah. But what's really happening is, I want to go and preach somewhere where people are going to pay attention, where they're going to hear what I say and they're going to do what I say, because that's what they hired me for. They hired me to preach the word to them. So if all I get back is they're fighting me on every single point. They're getting mad at me because I'm just telling them what the Word says concerning their conduct or their zeal or their devotion. If that's all it is, why? There's lots of people that need to hear the gospel out there. So he opens his heart to them, say, but you guys, Thessalonians, you guys are not like that. Secondly, he wants to defend himself. After his departure, there were some who accused him of being insincere, being a fraud. So he has to spend time defending his conduct. As I said, the best way to cause division is to attack the leaders. 3, Paul encourages them. Their new faith was being tested and they were being tempted to return to their pagan lifestyles, especially sexual impurity, because a lot of the religious activity surrounding the pagan religions was sexual. In many of their religions, having sex with the temple prostitutes was part of the religious exercise. They didn't have trouble getting the guys out to church. And so that was a powerful draw to draw people back into that lifestyle. And so he exhorts them, you don't be drawn back into that type of behavior. He also gives them further teaching. He gives them teaching in 2 critical areas: the details concerning the second coming of Christ. The idea here, the second coming, is mentioned 20 times in 2 letters. These 2 little letters, 20 times the return is mentioned. And also sanctified living. The second coming was the reason for the purified living of Christians. Paul explains this in more detail. How am I preparing myself for the return of Jesus? I'm purifying myself. I'm getting rid of all the junk. I'm scraping off the barnacles. I'm growing in Christ. That's how I get ready for that. Just like you get ready for company. What do you do if company is coming over? Well, usually, hopefully, you clean up, right? Let's sweep up, get the dishes off it's kind of the same thing. And then, of course, the last thing, fellowship. He encourages them and sends greetings to maintain the love and fellowship between this group and himself and these young Christians. So this is some of the background information to help you understand the material that we're going to study as we begin the series. In the meantime, some closing remarks concerning the relevance of this study for today. Why do we study this? Why should we study this? First of all, we study this epistle because in many ways it's a portrait of ourselves. We're a small group. We like to think, well, we're a pretty good sized Church of Christ. We got 400 people. But, come on. We're a small group here in this big old society. And we're in Oklahoma, so this is a hybrid place, the Bible Belt, Come to Montreal, 3.5 million people, 500 New Testament Christians. You want to feel small, go to these big cities. Go to New York, go to Tokyo, go to Beijing. In China, they have cities we have never even heard of that have 7 million people. We never even heard of these cities. 7 million people. So we're like a drop in the ocean. We're a tiny little group here, and we're surrounded by a large, secular, immoral society. Who controls the media that feeds the brains of our children? We don't. We don't. Without getting too preachy here, Satan controls the media. We don't control that. This media that our young people are consuming, 4 to 6 hours a day in front of a screen somehow? We don't control that. So it is always a temptation to return to a worldly lifestyle. So they're us in many ways. Secondly, we study this to gain a better understanding about the end of the world and the various teachings about these matters. We should know what the Bible teaches about the man of lawlessness. Who is the man of lawlessness? And what is the rapture? and the tribulation and what happens at the end. We need to know that. Not because it's scary, because it gives us confidence. We know what's going to happen. We know exactly what's going to happen. But because there's been so much teaching and so much publicity about false teaching on this particular matter, it's confusing to us. So we say, I don't even want to know about it. It'll all take care of itself. Well, it won't all take care of itself. We need to understand. If we didn't have to know it, it wouldn't be in the book. It wouldn't be in the book. So we need to get a handle on these things and try to separate fact from fantasy. And many of your friends and family, so on and so forth, they believe in this other thing. So it's quite an eye-opener when you very clearly lay out for them what's going to happen at the end of the world. And it's understandable. It's clear. You go, oh, well, that's not complicated at all. Well, no, it's not that complicated. And then, of course, we study to better prepare ourselves for the return of the Lord. He may come sooner or later, but we need to be ready in any case. And I'm struck by what Jesus says. He says, be ready, for you do not know when the Son of Man will come. And you know what? He means it. You don't know. You can't tell. During the Second World War, everybody thought it was going to be the end of the world because the world was at war. Hitler seemed, impossible to beat and so on and so forth. It must be the end of the world. They thought they could predict it. But Jesus clearly and plainly says over and over and over again, you don't know. Everything will go on just as it has always been going on. You'll be building buildings, buying houses, you'll be driving your car, having babies, celebrating your 65th anniversary, everything. There'll be a war over here and an earthquake over there and a flood over there, and stuff will just be happening. And my hand clap there, that's exactly how it's going to happen. No time to take a breath. Between two breaths, everything that Jesus says through Paul here will take place. And that's why we need to be ready. And hopefully we'll have a good study on this. Lots of other great material in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, but we'll certainly take a look at that. Okay, that's our class for this morning. Thank you for your attention.
Sister of Alexander the Great, and wife of the Macedonian king. Its location as a port city made it a prosperous city. Ephesus was the same kind of a city. And it was a port city, so it made it a very important city. Because they got around in ships. I guess it was faster those days to go around in ships than anything else. Now that's one of the slowest ways to get around. So transportation back then was pretty slow. But so it's a port city, a prosperous city, and it made several different cultures, including Jews. It's made up of several different cultures. Okay, so describe the church in Thessalonica when Paul was working with them.
They had a good understanding of what the church is supposed to be doing, because they were doing pretty good
Yeah,
considering
you
other
know,
people. Yeah.
because I guess Paul probably wasn't talking about them, but remember in Acts, I think it's Acts 20 verse 7. That may not be the right passage, but he said the Bereans are more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica because they accepted the word of God for what it is,
Oh,
the truth of it.
yeah.
But here he's saying they're a faithful church.
Yeah.
So the church is faithful, but the city is pretty
Oh,
corrupt.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What did they do when Paul was there?
They were trying to run them out.
Yeah, they ran him out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's only there about a month, which was not a very long time, but not a mature church for sure. That'd be fast maturity.
circumstances, they're doing well.
Yeah, he's joyful in gratitude for their faithfulness and their loyalty to Paul and his helpers. I mean, they stuck with him. Okay, what about Paul defends himself?
Because he's accused of being a fraud.
Okay,
He's not telling the truth.
okay, so he refutes the false accusations made against him. He sees how these attacks were intended to cause division and weaken the church. And if you think about it, he said, if you want to destroy a congregation, attack the leadership.
Yes.
And that's what happens every time. That's how Satan uses Christians to destroy Christians, basically. Okay, so Paul encourages the young Christians.
Yes.
So Paul lets them know that their faith is being tested, and so he encouraged them to remain faithful. And he commended them for their faithfulness. What about Paul gives further teaching? Two critical points. What were they?
The second coming of Christ and a sanctified living.
Okay. You're set apart. You're supposed to be living for God while you're here. And then fellowship.
To
Paul
maintain.
continues to encourage the young Christians by expressing thanks for their fellowship